420. Mr. Grow It. From the Stash Podcast.
Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this episode. They have the best grow tent kits on the market today. You get their ion board LED grow light, their grow tent, their ventilation system, clip-on fan, and their controller 69 to control it all. You also get their fabric pots, a trellis net, plant ties, and trimmers. Definitely a good price for all that you get in the kit. I'll have a link in the description section below so you can learn more about these grow tent kits, and the discount code TheStash15 works on both Amazon and their website, acinfinity.com.
Hey, what up, boys?
What up?
What's up, guys? Good to see you.
Back at it again.
Welcome to From the Stash Podcast. It's boy Rob, Mr. Grow It, Pigeons 420, a wink on the ones and twos. We are here today to talk. So we do.
Something we specialize in, I think it's fair to say.
You know what? I like to talk.
Used to do that introduction of us every single episode, and then we just
stopped
doing it. Now it's like never do it anymore, but bringing back memories there. Memories.
As it came out, it felt nostalgic. I'm like, we haven't done this in a long time, boys, even though we just last week were here. But yeah, I haven't.
Nobody ever knows. We just got back from Vegas. What are you talking about? We go there every week to record a lot of these episodes.
Well, it's weird, like how you'll watch like TV shows or movies and people have their catchphrase or their thing like that. You know what I'm saying? Like P's even gets like, yo, we'll be kicking it warm, kicking the flag warm. You know, I'm a little baked, but it's like a catchphrase or a slogan. I feel like the intro kind of was ours, and like we just forgot about it. We were like, "Oh yeah, that's right. You guys know us by now."
Jump to the assumption that people know who we are.
Yeah. Well, if you don't, this is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, Pigeon 420, myself, Rob, and we're gardeners, consumers, but also advocates of the lifestyle. Today, we're going to talk a little bit specifically about the garden, and it's a subject that I don't love, honestly, because I hate having plants like that. But these long-growing sativa, heavy air quote, flowers.
Yeah.
Now, you guys got experience with those?
Man, it's funny. Go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say I'm growing one right now, and I think that actually is what brought up this topic. Is last week we did a live stream, and it came up, and we're like, we can do a whole video on this because there really are a lot of unique things with these longer flowering cultivars or strains. If people want to call it a strain, right? We can go in that battle of strain versus cultivar. I know you get comments in the comment section when people like, I'm never calling it cultivar. Stop calling it cultivar. It's strain. We all know it is strain. The word strain actually isn't a botanical term. It's used for microbes and viruses. So it doesn't really hold any meaning when it comes to plants. However, that plant that we all know and love, that it's often used as it, right? But the proper term is cultivar. I think a lot of people are saying cultivar more often. The Oxford Dictionary describes it as a plant variety that's been produced in cultivation by selective breeding. And really, that plant that we all know and love has been selectively bred throughout many, many years. So, yeah, hear a lot of people talking about cultivar, but strain, cultivar, we use it interchangeably here in this episode. So long flowering strains, long flowering cultivars, the way you grow them is different than shorter flowering ones, right? And I think it's a fantastic topic. We're going to get into a lot of things this episode.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's funny because there's only a few things that I've tossed to the wayside since I started gardening. One of them is autoflowers. The other one is topping my plants. And the third one is growing long flowering cultivars. And the reason for that is because it just does not fit into my perpetual gardening style. Not to mention, you can get equally fire product with a much shorter flowering time. So unless it's for like some nostalgic or some kind of experimental reason, I can't quite pinpoint why anyone would want to be growing a long flowering type. It for me just throws a wrench into a system where I'm very, very systematically getting harvests every 8 to 10 weeks. I don't want to have, a Maui Wowie that goes 13 weeks. That just for me is just counterintuitive and prolongs my process.
I think a lot of it is based on, what science is getting to is the terpene you're going after. Unfortunately, in the legal world, whether it be botanical or commercial consumption, we'll say everybody's still stuck on indica sativa smoke, strains, Like, man, working with Franklin made my stomach turn whenever everybody be like, strain card, strain card. I'm like, it's a cultivar card. Stop calling it a strain card. And they're like, I'm looking for, we don't want anything too sativa leaning. I'm like, yeah, but for the growth wise. Like, no, this one finishes in 8 weeks. I'm like, that's not a sativa then, playboy. It's, you know, science, and the science is I wouldn't say subjective, but in some cases like this, it's not accepted by everybody. It's not widely accepted. But indica and sativa have been debunked in terms of the cannabinoid. There's no indica cannabinoid or sativa cannabinoid. It's going to be more botanical, if anything, or else leaning towards your terpenes and flavonoids that'll give you that characteristic that'll lean sativa-like or indica-like. But when it comes to growth, a sativa-like plant, traditionally, those of us who've grown for a while, we know they're lankier, they're thinner leaves, and they're longer flowering time. But with all these hybrids, it's not always guaranteed. You can have something that looks sativa-like, but doesn't grow sativa-like. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't have that lanky flowering time. So let's go into like a little bit of the tips for those who actually do have the sativa plant. Like, what do you guys do in the past when you've dealt with sativa plants, or currently with Chris? What do you do in that early training thing? Anything different from a regular hybrid or indica?
Well, one of the plants I'm actually growing right now is a longer flowering, and it's leaning towards the sativa side of things. Actually, I wish I never planted it. I didn't really know that it was going to be a longer flowering strain until after I planted it. So I guess I should have probably looked a little bit deeper into it. All the other plants I have in the tent are like 8-9 weekers. And then this one is going to be like 12, maybe even 13 weeks. So do the math on that. That's like 20, maybe 30 days longer this plant is going to be growing versus 8 to 9 weeker ones. So, you know, I know some people have made the mistake in the past of doing their 2-week flush too early, right? They're people who still believe in flushing. I know, controversial topic. Some people believe in it, some people don't believe in it. But if you do believe it and you do that flush or cut off nutrients, if you're cutting off nutrients at week 6, week 7, because you think it's an 8 or 9 weeker, then you're going to get a lot of leaves dying off with the pistils still being white. And then, yeah, you really have to just continue feeding all the way up until, you know, several weeks, you know, week 10, 11 plus, you're still feeding. So I don't know if that really answered your question or not. That's just one thing that, you know, in regards to growing these longer flowering strains that you have to really keep an eye out for.
Well, like, I'm thinking, I was almost trying to just make the point of like, ain't a whole lot different until the flip, I feel like. But the difference is knowing, all right, I'm going into flower, I'm going to flip next week. Well, when you're flipping the flower, you're really not flipping the flower with these sativas. They're going to veg for another couple weeks, up to 4 weeks, and they're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you got to kind of account for that increase in size. We always talk about that when you flip, you have to account for that. But even more with the sativa, it's lanky. It's going to keep growing in that flowering phase for a little longer than what you anticipate, because it takes longer to start flowering. It just gets bigger and taller and bigger and taller. And when you're in a tent, it's tough. Like, I'm getting ready to move my garden over here just because I need something easier and more convenient to be right in my space. Probably going to cut it down to maybe a 2x2 in the closet and a 4x4 to take up my whole office over in the corner. And I'm having to consider that fact as like, well, I don't have a bigger space that I can stretch it out and lay it flat now and have this big, long sativa that's a big tarantula in the tent with a trellis net, because I'm limited to 2x2 or 4x4 versus the 4x8 that I can stretch her all the way out. So it really makes you consider your space as a factor and your timing as a factor. And that's where it all comes into place more versus the indica or hybrid growth that you traditionally see, at least for me.
That's exactly what I'm going through right now. Is, like you said, the veg growth is very similar. Once you do that flip, that's when this particular strain, it's Hades Throne by Zaza Genetics. A big shout out to Zaza. It's something special to him. I mean, I don't know what the actual cross is. I know one of the parents is a land race. And so it really, I think it's 100% land race on the sativa side of things. And the tarantula type growth that you mentioned is what I experienced. You know what I mean? It stretched for 4 weeks. So 4 weeks of stretch. I didn't think it was going to stretch that long. 4 weeks of stretch. Started flowering later than some of the other cultivars that were in there. I didn't really account for it. You know, if I knew that it was going to stretch that long, if it was going to grow that much, I would have trained differently. You know, I definitely would have trained differently.
Training differently is very important, and you want to harness those first 4 weeks because you can use that in your favor. If you're going to do a scrog, even if you're just training in general, you can fill out your tent significantly in that first few weeks of flowering. You also got to take your food into consideration as well, because as you kind of touched on earlier, Chris, when it comes to the later portions of your flower, you're going to be starting later nutrients at an earlier time, and that's going to really mess things up. You're going to have yellow in leaves when your pistils are still white. So I personally like to extend the first couple weeks of my my flower nutrients just a couple weeks so that I can keep up, so that I can still apply. This is assuming that it's a 12, 13 weeker. Just still try to aim so that again, I'm speaking synthetically. I try to aim so that my week 8 nutrients on my feed chart land on the week 12 or 13 of the flowering cycle, and then work backwards from there. So they just extend the earlier portions of your bloom nutrients to fit that earlier time during the flip.
Isn't it crazy when you look at some of the back of the bottles and it says like 2-week veg time, and then like here's all your, you start feeding this heavy right here. I'm like, whoa. My plants don't like that. And my plants also want to veg a little bit longer than that. I'm not in a commercial setting. It's prime example of what you're saying there. Like I one time used my veg nutrients into flower, flip into the flowering cycle and kept the veg nutrients. And I swear it veg for 6 weeks. Like it needed less nitrogen, it needed a switch. I needed to trigger it besides the lighting cycle to be like, hey, stop. I'm catering to your veg growth. Well, it did switch to flowering. It seemed like my nodes were a lot further apart. The next time around, I just took my first 2 weeks of flower and turned that to 4 weeks of flower and my nutrients with synthetics. With organic, though, the last time I did it, it was a little tougher. It seemed like the plant was hungrier quicker. Like it ate everything up within that time period because, again, I had a flowering-based soil mix that I put it into. So I was assuming it was going to take what it took. But it really is vegging, even with that light condition, for another few weeks. It's growing and growing and growing. And you'll notice like areas of leaves, even if you measure the leaf size, the leaves increase a little bit. Like it's crazy how those grow. And I used to think, oh, with a sativa, I've got an extra 4 weeks of flowers. Look at all the more buds, they'll yield more. It's like, not necessarily. You just get a bigger plant. The plant's grown more. You have the same amount of time flowering. It just takes longer for it to flip. Now, some people will swear by, wanting it to manipulate some of those things to have it flip quicker, but I feel like a sativa is a sativa. You don't want to necessarily try to stress these plants out too much because, again, once you're in flower, your window of healing is gone. You got to ride it out. And that veg time, you can keep working it, but just know the more you veg that big sativa, the bigger it's going to get. It's almost like you want to start those short and squatty, knowing it's going to potentially triple in size, putting it into flower. So it's the nutrition regimen, the training, and the timing I feel are more crucial with a sativa, botanical based plant, than it would be with an indica. Have a lot more freedom. I
wouldn't have spent half the amount of time with my Maui Wowie in veg if I knew that it was going to be so long in the end. Because that girl, I ended up turfing it because that girl ended up being 5 feet tall, 5-6 foot tent, and it was an absolute panic. So yeah, you're going to take that training and that veg time into consideration throughout the entire process of that plant, so that you don't have any roadblocks or hurdles to jump over.
It sounds crazy, but when I first started, I consciously tried to get a sativa to have a staggering plant, to have one that I harvest 3-4 weeks later. You know what I'm saying? So I'm like, I'll never run out. I always have this. But size-wise, it never worked in my canopy. I'd have one that was just this tall freak, and then I'd have to have my trellis like laid halfway down to make it work. I feel like when you're going to grow, if you know consciously you're going to grow a sativa, you almost want to just grow sativas in that run. You know what I'm saying? You want to make sure you're treating them all and to flip the same. You're knowing that you're going to be, if you're using the trellis especially, you don't want to cut a portion of your canopy out. It's a real headache if you got a double canopy or double trellis too for your canopy, because then you're trying to weave this big lanky plant out of there. But getting it into that flowering space, well, your indica is not going to blow up. It's not going to get taller. I mean, it's going to maybe 50% larger, even maybe double, but it's not going to grow like the sativa. So it's made me reconsider, if I ever do run into sativa, I'm only growing the sativa. It's only going into flower. I'm not going to have a bunch of variety in there. Smoke wise, I wouldn't mind having those sativa traits, maybe the more citrusy, limonene, the poppin' flavor that I don't see all the time. But hybrids are getting those. People are taking these sativa cultivars and they're breeding them with super, strong indicas that grow 7-8 weeks, and they're finding the right, medium. But you'll still find those sativa characteristics in the plant that still will finish earlier. The skinny leaves, the breeder will call it a sativa dominant, or the company has it called a sativa dominant. Would you still treat those plants the same, given that flowering time's different, just looks different, or would you treat it like an indica then at that point?
Chris, no. Yeah,
Like,
no. You have to take all the traits into consideration before you start growing, so you don't have any surprises along the way. I want length. I want that stretch taken into consideration for my training when it's going to start to stretch, so that I know how much to train in preparation of. If I know it's going to be lanky come that flip, I'm going to make sure when it's going into flower that everything is down. She is flat. She is spread out. So that first little bit of time is spent on just correcting herself rather than shooting up, So there's definitely things I want to take into consideration. If I know she's not going to spend that much time stretching, well, then maybe I'm not going to spend that much time ensuring that she's spread out flat before I flip. I just want to get it spread out and tops facing upwards. So yeah, I want to take all these traits into consideration.
See, the reason I ask is because one thing I've noticed, with the thinner leaves, the more rigid leaves versus the fatter leaves, I see a lot less bushy sativas. I don't have to do nearly the defoliation. I don't have to do maybe a little bit more low stress training to get that bush out of it. But I literally have to treat it like I'm growing a whole different plant, let alone the same type of flower, we'll say. It's tough, man. I don't like it. It's made it so some of my harvests have suffered because I put all the attention into something that's going to be perfect. I put too much attention into training one plant, and then I don't take into consideration, well, that indica isn't going to blow up more. I've made that a little ball. It's a little globe. You know what I'm saying? It's not going to necessarily get me my yield that the sativa could get me, because I know it's going to double in size, triple in size yet. So that's where that growing monocropping almost. I don't go by monocropping if I need all just the same genetic in there. It's the same type of genetic. Are the indica or sativa growers? You know what I'm saying? The headbanger was a lot more of a sativa grower, but it was an indica smoker. It took about 9 to 10 weeks to finish, but it was a little more lanky and skinny. The Scooby-Doo was a little thicker. When I run those together, one would suffer for yield every time. When I did it by itself, I'd get the best of both worlds. It would yield, it would look good, and smoke good, of course, always, but it seemed like the biggest factor for me was knowing how that plant's going to finish. It's tough when you got a bag seed or a clone that's new or something that you picked up, because you don't really know. You can't plan. But if you have an idea looking at it, you can't just look at the plant nowadays and be like, oh, that's a sativa, because of those hybrids and these different characteristics. So you really got to plan more than ever if you want to have success when you're growing something like a sativa.
When you're growing these longer flowering strains, I mean, Pete kind of touched on it earlier with the scrogging. That's a benefit. It can be seen as a benefit to where you're going to have a strain that stretches longer for a longer period of time. You have more time to spread it throughout the netting and fill up that space, right? So there's a lot of people that are probably listening to this that do the scrog technique and would appreciate having the additional time to stretch the plant out across the entire net. And then I know everybody kind of does it differently as far as when to stop that stretch period, but stop the bending down into the net and then just let it just kind of grow up. But it definitely could give you an additional time to do that spreading throughout the net. So then when it does start to flower and it stops stretching, it could be all filled up grow space and be prime time, ready for flowering for however many weeks it's got remaining.
I feel like that's between an auto, traditional cultivar, indica, sativa. If you do all of the right steps based on that particular genealogy, you're going to be able to get the best results, no matter what. If it's not a good yield or this, that, if you treat that single cultivar right, knowing, hey, I got to give it extra veg time to have it be thicker, or hey, I've got to put it in sooner because I know it's going to stretch more, or I've got to, you got to know what you're doing. Almost that first run is the worst run, in my opinion, at least. We've talked about it before, Chris. We don't train our plants a lot the first time. So I want to see how it's going to grow. I want to see the characteristics versus, Some I know they prefer topping. They prefer low stress training. They prefer this, that, the other thing. If I know what it prefers immediately, I get the best results immediately. If I get a clone from a buddy, if I've seen it grow, like when I got the Sherb from Franklin, I knew how that grew there with the schwazing techniques and all that they were doing. And I was like, I think I could do a little better at home because I'm in a single home grow tent. I can low stress train it. I can trellis it out. I can make it a big plant. I can really work it how I want to. You know, you don't really know until you see it grow. And different environments are going to have different impacts on it, from HID light to the LED light, you know, the intensity of the nutrients to the organic side. The biggest factor for me is always, how long is it going to take to flower? Because then I know my window. I know how long I've got to work, because I'll still keep training it in that 4-week flip, you know. But if I don't know, I'm going to treat it just like I would the other plant. I'm going to treat it like my indica dominant or the plant that I know traditionally grows XYZ. So I consciously avoid sativas for this reason, because it throws me for a loop. I don't like sativa smoke by the end most times, not because the traditional effects that people will say, because everybody's endocannabinoid system is a little different. You know, sativas don't make me all wired and not coffee. Indicas don't knock me out like I'm on Zans or something. You know, it's different. But I don't really love that sharp, zingy sativa flavor that I get often, or the hazes or things like, you know what I'm saying? Not what I'm after. So I don't traditionally look for those things. I feel like if you know what kind of smoke you want, that's going to be your first starting point. You know, it's like, hey, are you willing to sacrifice a little bit of your time or your garden because you like that type of smoke? And if not, disregard the entire episode, because sativas aren't you. But if they are, well, you have to take into consideration that little bit of pain and suffering, we'll say. And that's that stuff that people is like, that's not even in my mix. Well, if that terpene was, sure as hell would be. You'd be like, I love that smoke though, man. Like I'll grow one of those every once, like if it was the Dreadnought OG. If that was a 10 to 12 weeker every time, you're like,
yeah, I would,
a year.
100%. And I would actually grow it all the time. But I would just take into the only reason I turf it to the side is because it doesn't fit into my current schedule or my current routine. But if I knew going into this that I was going to have a 12, 13 weeker, then I'm just going to plant more 12, 13 weekers, you know, and then on that way I can, you know, I'll have some variety. I'll throw in, you know, if the Dreadnought was, or I throw in some Maui Wowie, I'll throw in, you know, the Boondocks or not the Boondocks, that's auto. But what did you say you had from Zaza's there, Christopher?
Hades Throne. It's actually,
Hades.
I'm looking up right now. It's Dead Ops OG crossed with Persian Prince. And I believe the Persian Prince is the landrace.
Okay, so I would just make sure that I did a little homework beforehand. I prepped my garden in a way that I know that I was going to be able to get the harvest through the entire stage, and then, you know, have more than one long veg time cultivar, so that at least this way I'm working together. Or if I want mass variety, then I'm just going to take that feed into consideration and that stretch into consideration. That's all. But for myself, I'm only growing maybe 1 or 2 different cultivars for variety. So it's going to help me. I train my plants. I'm looking for something that's going to give me some material to twist around in a net, to tie down to the pot. It's tougher for me to use like the bushier ones, the squatter ones, because they don't really get all that much higher. So you really got to remove a lot of that potential great flower or a lot of that potential bud site to maintain a top. When in reality, if you didn't train it, you could probably get taller colas that would amount to the same that it took to spread it across the tent, if that makes any sense. So as someone who trains, I'm looking for those lankier, taller traits.
Well, and that's where a lot of times I notice sativa buds have those lankier colas, those spears. They may be like fluffier and not as dense, but they're spears. Walkie-talkie for the kids. Make sure.
Yes. This moment brought to you in part by family. Also, if you guys didn't know, we record these episodes live weekly on Twitch, twitch.tv/FromTheStash. Come join us every single Thursday. I'd give you a time to join, but it sometimes changes. Typically, it's 1 p.m. Central. But come join, influence the conversation, which gives us cheat codes all the time. And you can give your input on flowering times and what do you prefer, sativas, indicas, and what helps you advance your garden when it comes to training.
And question for the chat: do you feel like it's kosher to lock your office door when you're filming your podcast and the kids out there and beat on it, or just push in the door and then forget to close it? What do you think?
I'm on the other floor. I'm on an entirely other floor. You gotta like, yeah.
I mean, I pretty much am. There's so much space between it. It just will come busting. My son will just come, hey, Dad, you notice this blue Lego's a little darker than this blue one?
You'll lock it, but then the boom, 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 boom.
Exactly. I feel like that's almost worse than him just popping it open and coming in. But just as surprised as that, as surprised as those, the back to the epi, is the indica and sativa dominance. I've gotten plants, cultivars, where I've gotten beans, and it says, well, some will lean, they'll finish closer to this. Some will finish closer to this. You guys ever gotten that?
Yep.
That's the worst for me. Because I don't know what to plan for. I'm like, do I plan for this to be that sativa? And then it has those traits of the grow. I remember, shout out to Weed Nerd, RIP, man. I had TJ Subcool Vortex. And that one, everybody's like, oh, yeah, she'll be done 8 weeks flat. And then I had another buddy who's like, man, mine takes about 10, 11. I was like, no way. There's nothing in it that would make it take that long. Sure, I happened to get that one. And it did all the sativa characteristics, but it grew like an indica. It's weird, man. But
it's hard to plan for that.
I was going to say that's the hardest to plan for, you know, but if you have some of these things in mind and you know that, maybe that first run won't be the best, but you'll know you like the smoke. So you cloned it and you're like, all right, this next one, I'm tackling it sooner. I'm training faster. When I flip, I know that I'm going to do a second trellis maybe, or I'm going to do another line of training, or I'm going to do default. Either way, you're going to know some sort of tactics to tackle it on the second run. Usually the first one's tough, but the second one is the best, in my opinion. So I've always been blown away that P doesn't clone his plants half the time, where I'm like, that's insane. You did good this run. Imagine how much better you'll do the next run, you know? Because now you got familiar with the cultivar.
Yeah. Yeah. I often, don't clone. Great genetics gone to the wind.
I do want to clarify something that I spoke about earlier, which I don't want to mislead anybody into thinking that all land races are going to be sativa dominant, all land races are going to be stretchy, all land races are going to be longer flowering, right? So the land race that I had, or that's in this cross that I'm growing, the Hades Throne, that one is a longer flowering cultivar, right? A longer flowering strain. But you take, compare it to Pakistan Valley, which is a land race, which is what I've used on my Chill Out OG cross. That's a 55-day flowering period. You know what I mean? It's an indica, 100% indica, 55 days to flower. That's it. So not all land races are created equal. There are certainly some differences between those two. So I just want to clarify that. Another thing I want to touch upon is the feeding. So in particular, if we get a little bit deeper into that, I know a lot of people grow the organic side of things. Usually with 8-weekers, for example, a lot of people I know, they're using organic blends. There's so many different ways to go about it. Some people are using compost, worm castings, individual amendments. But a very popular method to grow with organic inputs is the organic blends. It's a blend of amendments. And you typically do an initial blending of the medium to begin. And then usually it's like every 30 days after that. Some people will do they'll do 30 days or 40 days in the veg stage. Then they'll do a top dressing before flipping the flower, at the flip of flower. Then every 30 days from there, right? So 30 days into flower, you're doing a top dressing. And that's usually it for the 8-weekers, right? You're usually harvesting after that. Well, these longer flowering cultivars, you're going to have to do another feeding, right? Around day 60, you're going to have to hit it again with another top feeding. If you don't, nutrients are going to be depleted from the medium. And of course, it depends on what size container you're in. If you're in a large bed, it's going to be a lot different than if you're in a 3-gallon grow pot, for example, or a 5-gallon grow pot. But generally speaking, usually doing another top dressing around day 60. That way it will get you to day 80, 90, however long that strain is in flowering for. So just want to mention that, particularly with on the organic side of things. So that's another reason why you really need to be aware of how your genetics grow. Talk to the breeder, get information from the breeder. How long should this be in flowering? Because once you have that information, then you can plan a little bit better.
I dealt with that with my headbanger and the first time I ran an organic grow, and it was me not realizing that, it finishes at 10 weeks, but I still need to finish, feed it properly. I got more of a fade than I've ever seen on anybody's organic plants because it was hungry. It wasn't because it was I just crushed it. It's no, headbanger never looks that way to finish. It's normally pretty green when it finishes. This one was reddish, yellowy, and just dying off, but it was because I didn't re-amend it. And honestly, if you're going to be, whether you're re-amending or top feeding or even doing some sort of a microbial tease to try to extend the food that's in there, I feel like in a super soil or an organic mix, it's only beneficial because you're going to reuse that soil again afterwards. My ignorant ass thinking that way. I was like, well, it'll be a waste. It's like, yeah, but I'm going to reuse that soil. So it's not a waste. It's going to go back into my next mix of soil, you know? It was the confusion of not thinking that the cultivar I had was a sativa. That was the biggest thing. Because as it was growing, I'm like, oh, that's right. It's still got another 2 weeks. She's still hungry. Like, oh, like I was on week 7, week 8, and I was getting a little yellowing. I was like, only 2 weeks left. No point to feed. It's like, well, yeah. At that point, I was completely depleted. It needed food. So it's a great point with the organic side. And same with if you're going to do the flush or the leach. Your last 2 weeks is not on your back of your bottle when it says week 8, stop feeding or whatever. Like, just like P was saying, extend that first 2 week period in your transition veg period or whatever, so to speak. Either extend your vegging or extend your flowering nutrients in. But just know that no matter what, that battery that you have in there only has so much life. And unless you recharge that battery, your plant's not going to be able to stay alive. So it's a great point, Chris.
You're inevitably. Sorry, finish, Chris.
I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up because what do you do in that case? And you kind of touch upon it. Say you think you're growing an 8 or a 9 weeker, and you've already cut off nutrients, right? You cut off nutrients at week 6 or week 7, starting to yellow, and you're like, wait a minute, this is going to go a lot longer than 9 weeks. What do I do? Do I continue just feeding it water only, or do you reintroduce nutrients at the time, right? I think if you're going with synthetics, reintroduce the nutrients. I have done that before, and you see the plant start to recover, and it starts to finish up, and then it's good to go. On the organic side of things, sure, I wouldn't hesitate going against the top dressing. Teas would be very valuable at that time, right? Where you're trying to boost your microbial population, increase that breakdown. Do a tea, add a tea, and at that point, maybe that'll help extend that plant so it won't just continue to fade and continue to yellow, continue to deteriorate while it still has 2-3 weeks left, you know? So,
See, and I think that's
what up.
You go, P. You were going to talk.
Okay, sorry. You have to address it. You have to address it because the same thing is in synthetic that I'm going to address the earlier, the longer veg at the beginning. If I get to week 8 on my chart, so week 12, 13 of the flower, well, I'll say 10, 11, 12, and I notice that it's not quite done yet. I'm rinsing and repeating that week 8 of nutrients. Just do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. And then when it's done, or when, at least when, you know, and we have a plethora of videos in regards to when to identify a proper harvest here on From the Stash, and as our own, on our own channels, you can check those out for more detail. But as you see it start to finish for harvest, that's when you're going to start to make the changes and wean off, if you will. So yeah, it's whether you're going organic or synthetic, I think really the results are the same, is that you need to take it into consideration, and you need to make sure that for the appropriate time, she's getting the appropriate food. Earlier on, she wants nitrogen. Later on, she's going to want phosphorus, no nitrogen, no CalMag, or at least less of. So just take that into consideration. We understand what the feeding schedule is like for these plants. Just make up for it during that time frame, and I think you're going to be okay. I think really the only wrench that gets thrown into the equation is when we don't know we have a longer flowering sativa. I think that's really it. If we know what we're going to do, we're going to be able to take steps to prevent it, or at least take steps to maximize its potential, like we said, either by training or double trellising or so on and so forth. You know, maximize rather than, you know, lose out.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I was going to say. So I was going to say, as long as you have an idea that this is there, the plant's going to give you those signs. Like, you read the plant. Once you can read the plant, it's like reading Braille. And nobody know how to do it. But once you figure it out, you can do it, you know? Or go get the Torah. Throw your mind for a loop. That one read you. Not only is Hebrew hard to read, but reading it backwards. You start from this side, go that way. Like, it's throws you for a loop. But once you learn it, it ain't so hard. It's not that I'm good at that, but for plants, you see certain signs that no matter what it is, you're like, oh yeah, it's not ready, or oh yeah, you know, she's hungry, or she's depleted in this area. You start to notice these signs, and when you do, if you can address those and attack them properly, knowing what kind of cultivar you have, it makes everything smoother.
What a great topic. I'm glad we got into it this week. I'm sure that there are things that we didn't think of that people who are listening are thinking of. If there are some things that we didn't think of that you have for tips for growing these longer cultivars, let us know in the comment section below. Love going down there and reading the comments and seeing what else there is to be said about growing longer flowering cultivars.
Yeah, I strongly believe that I have a belief that there isn't something in nature that doesn't have a cause. There's a reason why these flowers have longer flowering times. And I think we kind of touched on it in regards to terpenes, maybe the cannabinoids in general. Maybe there's things that are developed that just take a little more time that we as breeders and as cultivators haven't really figured out yet. So maybe there's something that somebody knows that I don't. So I'd love to hear from you.
The environment, a lot of it's the environment, like where the original land races came from. It had to basically acclimate to that area. So if the time for, like, we need to get Todd on the show. Todd McCormick broke it down great. Why we don't
I've
see
been talking to him.
He's a great dude.
He should be here.
He'll be here soon. We'll get him on here. But a lot of sativas
reach out to him.
See, everyone here do it.
Everyone.
But
everyone.
You know, people who are in areas who are guerrilla growing outside, they don't have 12 weeks. They need to finish as soon as the season's done, you know? And so that's where a lot of times I feel like nature has created these things, and the terpenes are the effect. The cause, environment, the effect is the effects we get. And it's a beautiful thing, man. This plant has so many layers to it, and I think that's what keeps us going for hundreds of episodes, to keep talking about this with all of our content. I mean, science keeps evolving, and I'm here for it, man. I love it.
Oh, yeah. Great conversation, boys. If you guys want to see more, as we mentioned, you can follow us, twitch.tv/FromTheStash. You can check out FromTheStash.com or StashMerch.com. Check out all the latest merch. I think you might even see a new drop, or the one that Chris has on right now. There's all kinds of new stuff. Make sure you go check it out. My name is Pigeons. That's ROB CLtv. That's Mr. Grow It. And the guy behind the scenes you don't see, but you hear so much of, that's Wink. We appreciate you so much, brother. Until next time. Peace.
Peace.